Imagine you are standing at the edge of the world as it was known. Not the edge of a continent, not a coastline, but the boundary between order and chaos as the people of this time understood it. Behind you, a cluster of mud brick structures rise from the flat earth along the banks of a wide, brown river. Children move between the buildings. Smoke curls upward from clay hearths. The air smells of wet soil, animal dung, and something else. Something heavier. A humidity so dense it sits in the lungs like a second skin. In front of you, stretching to every horizon, is the floodplain. And this year, it is not behaving as it should. We are in the 6th millennium of human settlement along the rivers the ancient world would come to call the Tigris and the Euphrates. The year, by our modern reckoning, is somewhere around 4000 BC, at the cusp of what archaeologists call the late Ubaid and the early Uruk periods. This is not yet Sumer as we know it. There are no ziggurats, no cuneiform tablets, no formal priesthood with written laws. What there is instead is something older and in many ways more fragile. A network of proto-urban settlements, village clusters growing beyond what villages were ever meant to be, stretching along the waterways of southern Mesopotamia in a world that was actively, violently changing around them. And this is the world that ancient texts, from Genesis to the Book of Enoch to the Sumerian king list, remember as something extraordinary. A world before the flood. A world, according to these traditions, where the boundaries between the human and the divine were not yet fixed, where beings of enormous stature and mysterious origin walked among the settlements and shaped the course of human development. The ancient text we know as the Book of Enoch describes a time when the Watchers, angelic figures of enormous power, descended to earth and took human form, producing offspring of terrifying size and appetite. The Nephilim, who consumed the resources of the land until the land itself could no longer sustain them. The Genesis account echoes this, briefly, cryptically, in those strange verses about the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the heroes of old, the men of renown. Whether one reads these as literal history, as astronomical metaphor, or as the encoded cultural memory of a catastrophic era, that the important thing is this. The people of 4000 BC believed they were living in a world shaped by forces far beyond human scale. And from where they stood, looking at what the sky and the rivers were doing, it is not difficult to understand why. Because the climate of the late 5th and early 4th millennia before our era was not stable. It was not generous. It was in motion. Around 6200 BC, climate scientists have identified a significant cold and dry event that altered precipitation patterns across the Near East and North Africa. The effects rippled forward for centuries. By 4000 BC, the region was experiencing what paleoclimatologists refer to as the Holocene climatic optimum transitioning into a drier, more volatile phase. What this meant for the settlements along the Tigris and the Euphrates was not subtle. The rivers that had made life possible in this otherwise inhospitable landscape were becoming unpredictable. Seasonal flooding, which had always been the engine of fertility in the alluvial plain, began to arrive with greater intensity and less regularity. Some years brought catastrophic inundation. Others brought drought so severe that the reed marshes dried to cracked mud and the fish retreated to shrinking pools in the river's main channel. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tel El Ubaid, Eridu, and the deeper layers beneath Uruk show us the physical evidence of these fluctuations. Sediment cores drawn from the region reveal thick layers of waterborne deposits interspersed with ash and hearth remnants. The geological signature of communities repeatedly flooded, rebuilt, and flooded again. At Eridu, Yen considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the oldest city in the world and the first place that kingship descended from heaven. Archaeologists have documented at least 18 distinct levels of occupation, each layer built atop the debris of the one before. These were not people who fled from difficulty. They were people who stayed and rebuilt, season after season, generation after generation. Because the river, even in its fury, was still the source of everything they needed. But understanding what the river gave requires understanding what it took. A flood in 4000 BC was not a flood as we typically imagine one today. There were no weather services, no levees, no emergency broadcasts. The warning signs were the ones you had learned to read since childhood. The color of the water upstream, the behavior of the birds, and the smell of the air before the rains came from the distant mountains of Anatolia and Zagros, where the rivers were born. A man standing in his barley field in the alluvial plain might have no more than a day's warning, sometimes less, before the water rose. And when it came, it could cover the flat land entirely, transforming the world into a shallow inland sea stretching from horizon to horizon. The Sumerian flood narrative, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the earlier Eridu Genesis text, describes exactly this kind of total inundation. The gods, displeased with the noise and chaos of humanity, send a flood to silence the earth. One man, warned by the god Enki, builds a vessel and survives. When the waters recede, he emerges into a world transformed, the old settlements gone, the old order swept away. The Genesis account of Noah carries the same structural memory. Whether one reads these as the record of a specific catastrophic event or as the accumulated cultural memory of many floods across many generations, the archaeological record makes clear that this was a world that knew catastrophe intimately and had incorporated it into the core of its theology. Some researchers, pointing to evidence of a dramatic marine transgression in the Black Sea basin around 5600 BC, have argued that a single massive flooding event may lie behind the flood traditions of the ancient Near East. Others point to the periodic catastrophic flooding of the Mesopotamian plain itself as the more likely source. The truth may be both, or neither, or something we have not yet recovered from the sediment. What matters for our understanding of life in 4000 BC is that these people did not experience floods as aberrations. They experienced them as the fundamental rhythm of existence. The land was given and taken. The river was mother and destroyer. The divine was not distant. It was in the water rising around your ankles at midnight. Into this volatile landscape, the settlements grew. And as they grew, the pressure on the land intensified in ways that made the effects of climate change harder to absorb. The Ubaid period had seen a gradual process of village consolidation. Smaller hamlets were absorbed into larger centers. Population density along the riverbanks increased. This meant more mouths to feed from the same floodplain agriculture. More animals grazing the same reed marshes, while some more wood harvested from the same riparian forests for fuel and construction. Archaeological evidence from pollen cores in the region shows a significant decrease in arboreal species during this period, consistent with deforestation driven by human activity. When the rains reduced and the floods became less predictable, a landscape already stressed by growing human demand had less resilience to absorb the shock. This is the world the ancient texts describe as inhabited by beings of extraordinary appetite. The Nephilim of the Book of Enoch are described as consuming everything. The labor of people, the animals, the fish, the birds, the very land itself. When read through the lens of ecological stress, this imagery becomes strangely legible. Whatever the theological interpretation, the cultural memory encoded in these texts seems to preserve something real. a time when the demands placed on the landscape exceeded what the landscape could sustain. When the old order collapsed under its own weight, and when the world that emerged from the catastrophe was profoundly different from the one that preceded it. Because something did emerge. By 3,800 to 3,500 BC, the archaeological record shows a dramatic acceleration of urban development centered at Uruk in southern Mesopotamia. Within a few centuries, Uruk would become the largest city on Earth, a settlement of perhaps 50,000 people surrounded by dependent villages, connected by trade networks stretching from Egypt to Afghanistan. The invention of writing, the formalization of temple administration, and the standardization of weights and measures. All of these developments cluster in the Uruk period as if the catastrophes of the preceding centuries had compressed human ingenuity into something harder, more structured, more permanent. Scholars debate the causes of the Uruk expansion. Some point to climate shifts that made the southern alluvial plain more productive as northern regions dried. Others point to the development of irrigation technology sophisticated enough to channel and control the very floods that had threatened earlier settlements. Others still point to the organizational demands of managing a growing population through repeated crises as the engine that drove the development of administrative complexity. The answer is likely all of these things operating simultaneously. Catastrophe, it turns out, is one of civilization's oldest teachers. In the meantime, the daily lives of those living through the transition were shaped by conditions we can only partially reconstruct. Water was drawn from the rivers and canals, but was not clean in any sense we would recognize. Contamination from animal waste and human refuse was endemic. Gastrointestinal illness, parasitic infection, and waterborne disease were permanent features of existence, visible in skeletal remains from sites like Tel Brak, and in the coprolite record that survives from drier regions of the ancient Near East. A child born in a settlement along the Euphrates in 4000 BC had perhaps a 50% chance of surviving to the age of 5. An adult who survived childhood could expect to live, if fortunate, and if the floods cooperated, to somewhere between 35 and 45 years of age. The bones of those adults, when archaeologists find them, are marked with signs of heavy labor, nutritional stress during periods of drought, and the skeletal signatures of chronic infection. Their medicine was a blend of plant pharmacology and ritual intervention that made no distinction between the physical and the spiritual, because in their understanding, there was none. Illness was not merely a biological event. It was a communication from the divine, a sign that something in the relationship between the human and the sacred had broken down. Healers, who in this period were likely the same individuals who managed the ritual life of the settlement, worked with poultices of willow bark and herbs that we now know have genuine pharmacological properties, alongside incantations and offerings intended to restore the cosmic balance that disease represented. The distinction between physician and priest would not crystallize for centuries. Here, they were one. If you could visit the sites where these settlements once stood, and you can, the mounds of Tel El Ubaid in southern Iraq, the ancient Tel of Eridu just south of the modern city of Nasiriyah, the layered remnants of early occupation beneath Uruk itself, you would stand on ground that was home to human beings navigating one of the most consequential and dangerous transitions in our species' history. The earth beneath your feet holds the remnants of their hearths, their pottery, their grain stores. They're dead, and it holds the sediment of floods that reshaped their world, and the ash of the fires they lit to stay warm and to cook and to signal to one another across the flat, dark plain. They did not know they were building civilization. They knew only that they needed to eat, to shelter their children from the water and the heat to appease forces they could not fully understand, and to find a way to continue when continuing seemed almost impossible. And somehow, against conditions that would seem to preclude survival, they continued. They rebuilt after each flood. They dug new canals when the old ones silted. They developed new ways of storing grain against the lean years, new ways of organizing labor, new ways of encoding knowledge so it could be passed forward to people they would never meet. Everything we have built since is built on that. Not on the kings and the monuments, but on those anonymous hands in the mud, reconstructing a world that the climate and the rivers kept trying to take away. That is perhaps the most humbling thing the ancient past offers us. Not the grandeur of what was achieved, but the quiet, stubborn refusal to stop trying. If you find yourself curious about where else that refusal was tested, what other eras carried their catastrophes with that same silent endurance, leave your thoughts. There are so many worlds still buried, still waiting to be walked.